Women have always worked. But work, as we know, is a fickle category. What counts as work is defined by people in power, and we've already seen how religion and race can be involved. So can gender. In fact, one of the biggest distinctions that goes into making this category of work is the distinction between work and motherhood. In this episode of Religion at Work, we'll explore some religious deep stories about family, work, and motherhood that are actually religious claims about how the world ought to be. Over time, these claims have just become so naturalized, so dominant in our society, that it feels normal to devalue work historically done by women. This isn't news. We all know about the wage gap. We know that white women are paid less than white men, and women of color are paid even less than that. We know about other kinds of discrimination that happens, both in the workplace and elsewhere. These are things we can see on the surface, they're visible. But let's dig deeper. How did Americans come to think about work this way, to define work this way? How could we go about defining it differently? Let's start by looking at some of the earliest legislation about women and work in the United States. By 1930, many of the 48 states at the time had passed laws protecting women in the workplace. Sounds nice, right? But these weren't actually laws protecting women from sexual harassment or pay discrimination or things like that. They were laws restricting when, where, and for how long women could work, so that they could do their most important jobs, as mothers. As early as 1852, some states had begun restricting the number of hours women could work in a day, all with the intent of protecting women from any negative consequences that wage work might have on their reproductive capacity or family life. In a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis and Josephine Goldmark compiled over 100 pages of arguments for why women's work should be restricted by the state. Let's take a look at some of them. One argument was that, generally speaking, women work many more hours every day than men, because after the day in the workshops is ended, many of them must be occupied with household cares, while men may rest. The report said that long hours in a factory negatively impacts women's health, making it more difficult for them to have children. Plus, if young women are spending all their time in a factory, they don't learn housekeeping skills, so how would they fulfill their family duties? They argued that when the mother of a family spends the night or evening in work, disorder is almost unavoidable, and the comfort of the men as well as of the children dependent upon her ministrations is lost. And what will happen to a family, they asked, when a mother is compelled to work in a factory 10 hours, toiling all day, coming back after dark to her children, weary, jaded, fretful, almost desperate? Tidiness, cleanliness, and happiness are impossible under these circumstances. The U.S. Supreme Court found these arguments persuasive, ruling in 1908 that women's physical weakness and the potential ill effects of overwork on them and their families justified these kinds of restrictions. There's a lot going on here. It's a deep story about motherhood. To be a mother requires 1. Chastity before marriage, 2. Giving birth to a healthy baby, 3. Doing household chores to care for her children and husband, cooking, cleaning, and so on, and 4. Maintaining order and morality in the family. You might notice the rigid gender roles here. Of course the husband can't contribute to the household chores. You see the concern for sexual purity and the desire to avoid disabled or unhealthy women and children. We could spend a long time on any of these, and they all have something to do with religion. But let's dig into that last one, maintaining order and morality in the family. Why is this the mother's responsibility? And why would the government care? This is a good time to notice which women were the subject of these concerns. Spoiler alert, it's white women. Think back to our last episode and how Black and Indigenous families were treated by white Christians and the U.S. government. Black motherhood wasn't sacred. Native families weren't sacred. They were enslaved and separated. The laws restricting women's work were about protecting white motherhood, white families, and white future generations. They were quite literally about maintaining white supremacy, and religion was deeply involved. In the mid-19th century, white middle-class Protestants embraced the idea that men and women should occupy separate spheres. Men were out in public, doing business, fighting wars, making money. Women remained in the private sphere, what some writers called the empire of the home. At home, they were protected from the vices and temptations of the world, especially the capitalist economy. They could maintain a kind of innocence from so-called worldly concerns. And with that innocence came a duty to protect the family's spirituality and morality. But a mother's duty wasn't just to her own family. By teaching her children Protestant values of discipline, restraint, and work, she was doing the work of civilization. She was ensuring that the nation, the United States, continued to be populated and governed by white citizens who adhered to those same values. The people arguing for labor restrictions to protect women were very explicit about this. Brandeis and Goldmark's brief to the Supreme Court argued that, in communities where excessive working hours have long prevailed, one generation after another has suffered from overwork, inherited weakness, and the loss of all family decencies, until actual race degeneration has resulted. Some reports talked about women's bodies as a kind of natural resource. It is fair to ask, said the Washington Bureau of Labor Statistics, if it is not worthwhile to give some attention to the problem of conserving and protecting the physical strength of our wage-earning womanhood. Let's be clear, it's not bad to set limits on how many hours an employer can make you work. It's not bad to be concerned about the effects of work on an employee's health. It's not bad to give working parents time with their children. Other labor reformers were arguing for exactly the same thing, for everyone. But these kinds of laws only gained widespread support when they were specifically about protecting working-class white women who would or could become mothers. Interestingly, only 2% of wage-earning women even worked at night, but nearly all of those women were of childbearing age. And in the early 20th century, white birth rates were declining, while immigration to the United States was increasing. White Protestants, both elite and middle class, were concerned about losing their dominant status. If they fell from power and the United States came to be governed by other people with different values, they feared that the whole nation would crumble. So they took extreme measures to avert that risk. Men still had the right to make contracts without interference from the state, but a woman's right to contract was deemed inessential in comparison to the need to maintain white power over the nation. This is white Christian nationalism. It's the exact same story we hear from right-wing white Christians today. Any deviation from what they claim as Christian values will result in the destruction of the nation. They focus on the family because the white family has always been the key to maintaining white Christian power. And if women's rights need to be sacrificed in pursuit of that power, well, I think we know what happens then. But back to work. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 put an end to this kind of protective labor legislation for women by requiring equal treatment of all genders in the workplace. Since then, women's rights have come a long way. But the binary between work and motherhood persists. Parenting for people of any gender is not categorized as work. It's not compensated, but for women especially, it's their most important job. That's a deep story we can trace back to white Protestants in the 19th century. That's how they wanted the world to be, not how it has to be. What if we didn't differentiate between waged work and women's work? We don't have to define work as labor that happens in the public sphere, not the home. Remember, there's no naturally occurring category called work. What other stories could we tell about what it means to be a person doing human activities that contribute to the survival of individuals, families, and communities? It's not easy to think outside the dominant deep story. It's like riding a bike next to ruts in a road. It's easy to fall into those pre-existing patterns. There's less resistance and a clear direction in which to ride. But you'll only get to the same place as everyone else who followed that pattern. So until next time, think about this. Where do you want to go? Thanks for watching.